October 1944. A German soldier becomes a prisoner of war. He expects hatred. He expects cruelty. He expects to pay for the crimes of the regime that forced him to fight. Instead, an American farmer does something unthinkable, something that breaks every rule, something that will change both their lives forever. This isn't just a story about World War II. This is the story of how a man who was supposed to be an enemy became a son. How a prisoner of war inherited not a farm, but something far more valuable, a future, a family, and a new homeland in the heart of America. And it all started with a single act of defiance on a Michigan farm in 1944. This is the incredible true story of Kurt Gable and Fred Herbst. May 18, 1944, Monte Cassino, Italy. The air tasted of cordite and pulverized stone. Kurt Gable crouched behind what remained of a monastery wall, his Wehrmacht uniform already 2 sizes too large for his 19-year-old frame, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and the red dust of Italian earth. 300 meters away, American artillery thundered its monotonous symphony of destruction. He could feel each explosion in his chest cavity, a rhythmic reminder that his war, this absurd involuntary war, was ending. He had been in uniform for 11 months. He had fired his weapon exactly twice, both times at nothing in particular. The concept of dying for the Führer, for the fatherland, for anything at all, struck him as cosmically ridiculous. He was a farmer's son from the Sudetenland, a boy who understood the language of cattle and crops, not ideology and conquest. The propaganda had been everywhere, of course. In school, on the radio, plastered across every available surface in his village. One people, one Reich, one Führer. But propaganda is a fragile thing when you've spent your childhood elbow deep in a cow's womb, pulling a breech calf into the world at 3 in the morning. Reality has a way of making grand narratives seem small. "See come," whispered Franz, the boy beside him. "They're coming." Kurt nodded. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Fear had exhausted itself sometime around dawn. What remained was a hollow curiosity about what happened next. What happened next was remarkably undramatic. American soldiers appeared through the smoke like figures in a shadow play, solid, purposeful, pointing rifles that seemed almost politely. A sergeant with a face like weathered oak bark gestured for them to raise their hands. Kurt complied. His war, such as it was, ended not with thunder, but with a gesture. "Lucky bastards," the sergeant said in English, though Kurt wouldn't understand the words for months. "You just won the lottery." August 1944, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. The transport ship USS General W.P. Richardson carried 2,147 German prisoners of war across an ocean that seemed determined to empty Kurt's stomach of everything he'd eaten since childhood. For 11 days, he existed in a peculiar limbo between nations, between identities, between one life and whatever came next. Below deck, in the converted cargo hold, men lay in triple-stacked bunks, a mass of unwashed bodies and cigarette smoke and whispered speculation. Some still believed in the final victory. Some had believed in nothing for years. Kurt occupied a space somewhere between, not ideological, just profoundly uncertain. He learned his first English phrases from a guard named Mitchell, a black soldier from Georgia who seemed to find the entire situation amusing. Mitchell would point at objects and state their names with exaggerated clarity. "Water," "bread," "don't be stupid." The last phrase proved most useful. What struck Kurt, what struck all of them, was the abundance. Even on a military transport ship, even as prisoners, they ate better than they had in the Wehrmacht. White bread, real butter, coffee that actually tasted like coffee. The cognitive dissonance was acute. They had been told Americans were starving, that the plutocratic democracy was collapsing under its own decadence. Instead, even the guards ate like kings. "They're fattening us for slaughter," muttered Heinrich, a true believer who had held on to his convictions with the tenacity of the genuinely frightened. But Kurt was thinking about the bread. It was soft, impossibly soft. He had forgotten bread could be soft. September 15th, 1944. Camp Custer sprawled across 16,000 acres of Michigan countryside, a temporary city of barracks and administration buildings that housed 5,000 German prisoners of war. It was, Kurt would later reflect, less a prison than a holding facility for an ideological detox that nobody had quite planned, but everyone needed. The barbed wire was there, certainly. The guard towers stood at regular intervals. Machine guns pointed inward with unmistakable intent. But the regime inside the wire was almost absurdly civilized. Prisoners received wages, 80 cents per day, for their labor. They could purchase cigarettes, toiletries, even beer from the camp canteen. They formed orchestras, theater companies, football leagues. It was, in its way, the strangest imprisonment imaginable. Kurt was processed, deloused, photographed, and assigned a prisoner number, 31G458772. The number would follow him through the next 2 years, stamped on his work permits, his pay stubs, his correspondence. Years later, he could still recite it from memory, those digits a peculiar kind of bookmark in the story of his life. The camp newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, arrived weekly, printed by Prisoners for Prisoners. Kurt devoured it, not for the news, which was carefully curated by American intelligence, but for the arguments that raged in its letter section. Here, finally, men could speak without fear of the Gestapo, without the performative loyalty that had poisoned every conversation in the Wehrmacht. Some still defended the Reichs. Most did not. A few, the ones who had seen the camps, the ones who had participated in the machinery of genocide, said nothing at all. Their silence was its own confession. Kurt wrote his first letter home on September 20th. It took 6 weeks to reach the Sudetenland, passed through 3 different censors' offices, and arrived with large sections blacked out. His mother's response, received in January, was brief. "We are alive. We are hungry. The Russians are coming. Do not come back." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his footlocker. He would not come back, not because he didn't want to, but because there would be nothing to come back to. October 1944. Washington, D.C. While Kurt adapted to captivity, American bureaucrats wrestled with an arithmetic problem of staggering proportions. The war had consumed 12 million American men, pulling them from farms, factories, and foundries. Agricultural production had to increase. The military needed food, allies needed food, the world needed food, but there was nobody left to plant or harvest it. The solution was pragmatic to the point of absurdity. Use enemy prisoners to save American farms. The Geneva Convention permitted it. Prisoners of war could be employed in non-military labor, provided they were paid, fed, and treated humanely. In the summer of 1944, the War Department initiated what would become the largest foreign labor program in American history. By 1945, over 400,000 German and Italian POWs would be working on American farms, in canneries, in lumber camps, a ghost army of former enemies preserving the American economy. Michigan alone received 26,000 prisoners. They picked cherries in Traverse City, harvested sugar beets in Saginaw, worked the potato fields of the Upper Peninsula. For the prisoners, it was an escape from the monotony of camp life. For the farmers, it was the difference between survival and bankruptcy. For Kurt Gabel, it would be transformation. November 3rd, 1944, Saline, Michigan. The truck rattled down Textile Road carrying 6 prisoners and 2 guards, each mile taking Kurt farther from the wire and deeper into a landscape that felt disturbingly familiar. Rolling farmland, bare trees against gray November sky, the smell of livestock and turned earth. It could have been the Sudetenland if he squinted and ignored the occasional American flag hanging from a porch. Fred Herbst's farm occupied 160 acres of good soil south of Saline, a small town of 1,500 souls that had sent 47 of its boys to war. Fred was 53, built like a man who had spent 30 years wrestling with equipment and livestock, his hands scarred from 1,000 minor agricultural casualties. He stood in his farmyard that November morning, arms crossed, watching the truck approach with an expression that revealed nothing. Kurt expected hostility. He had been told repeatedly, these people's sons were fighting in Europe. These people watched newsreels of American casualties. These people had every reason to hate him. The guard, a corporal named Jensen, made the introductions with bureaucratic efficiency. This is Kurt Gabel, speaks some English, farm background, can handle cattle. Fred nodded slowly. He walked a circle around Kurt, assessing him the way he would assess a horse at auction. Kurt stood still, suddenly aware of how thin he still was, How young he must look. "You know cows?" Fred asked finally. Yes, Kurt replied. "My father, he has farm. I work since—" He gestured vaguely, indicating childhood. Fred grunted. "My boys are in France. You German?" "Yes." "You a Nazi?" Kurt hesitated. This was the question, the only question that mattered. "No," he said quietly. They make me soldier. I am farmer." Fred studied him for a long moment. Then he did something Kurt would remember for the rest of his life. He extended his hand. "Then welcome to Michigan." The rules were explicit, printed in triplicate, and distributed to every farmer employing POW labor. 1. Prisoners shall not enter the farmer's residence under any circumstances. 2. Prisoners shall not eat meals with the family. 3. Prisoners shall be supervised at all times. 4. Fraternization beyond necessary work communication is prohibited. Fred Herbst violated all 4 rules before sunset. It happened practically without ceremony or ideological deliberation. They had spent the afternoon in the dairy barn, Kurt demonstrating a competence with cattle that made Fred's eyebrows rise appreciably. The boy knew what he was doing. More than that, he worked with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that cows, unlike armies or nations, operated on their own schedule. By 4 o'clock, Kurt had diagnosed a case of mastitis in one of the Holsteins, supervised the milking of 32 cows, and fixed a gate latch that had been broken for 3 weeks. Fred watched this performance with growing satisfaction. Finding good help had been impossible for 2 years. Finding someone who actually knew what they were doing was a minor miracle. When Ella Herbst appeared in the barn doorway at 5:30, calling them to dinner, Fred made a decision that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with pragmatism and decency. "You eat with us," he said to Kurt. Kurt froze. "The rules." "I got a table big enough for one more. You worked hard. You'll eat proper." The Herbst kitchen was warm, fragrant with pot roast and fresh bread. Kurt stood in the doorway, acutely aware that he was violating a direct order, that this could mean punishment, that nothing about this made sense according to the rules that had governed his life for the past year. Ella Herbst, a woman who had been feeding farmhands for 30 years, simply pointed at a chair. "Sit before it gets cold." He sat. The meal proceeded in relative silence, interrupted only by requests to pass salt or butter. Fred's daughter Agnes, home from her job at the Saline Observer, stared at Kurt with undisguised curiosity. He kept his eyes on his plate, but the food, God, the food. Pot roast with actual meat, potatoes swimming in butter, green beans, bread with jam, coffee with real cream. "You got family?" Ella asked. "Yes, mother, 2 sisters, in Sudetenland." "They safe?" Kurt thought about the letter, about the Russians coming, about his mother's warning never to return. "I don't know," he said honestly. Fred and Ella exchanged a glance, one of those married people communications that required no words. "Well," Ella said finally, "you'll write them, tell them you're being treated decent." That night, in the small room above the garage where he slept, Kurt wrote the longest letter of his life. He described the farm, the work, the impossible kindness of people who had every reason to hate him. He described the meal, the warmth, the strange feeling of being treated like a human being rather than a prisoner or a tool. He could not have known, as he folded the letter carefully, that it would never arrive. The Sudetenland was in flames. The mail had stopped. His childhood home would be seized by Czech partisans in 6 months. His family scattered to refugee camps across Austria and Bavaria. But that night, in a small room in Michigan, he wrote as if his words could reach across the ocean and time and chaos to say, "I am alive. I am being treated with dignity. The world is not what we were told. Winter in Michigan is not kind to the unprepared. It arrives in November like an occupying force, settles in until March, and demands adaptation or surrender." Kurt had grown up with bohemian winters, but Michigan cold had its own character, a damp, penetrating cold that found every gap in clothing, every weakness in resolve. The farm work continued regardless. Cows needed milking at 5 a.m. In January, as certainly as in July, equipment needed maintenance, fences needed repair, wood needed splitting. Kurt discovered that American farming, for all its mechanical advantages, still demanded the same fundamental bargain: constant labor in exchange for survival. But he also discovered something else. Fred Herbst was teaching him. It happened obliquely, without formal instruction. Fred would demonstrate a technique for treating hoof rot, then step back and watch Kurt repeat it. He would explain the maintenance schedule for the tractor, the quirks of the Model B Ford that demanded specific coaxing on cold mornings. He taught him English alongside agriculture. This is a drawbar. This is a cultivator. This is how you tell when the hay is ready to cut. By December, Kurt could conduct full conversations in English, his accent thick, but his vocabulary functional. By January, he knew the farm as well as Fred did. Every quirk of livestock, every temperamental piece of equipment, every rotation schedule for the fields. They developed rhythms. Morning milking in silence, both men half asleep, breath visible in the cold barn air. Breakfast with the family. Kurt's initial discomfort fading into routine. Long days of winter work, butchering, maintenance, planning for spring planting. Evenings when Fred would turn on the radio and they would listen to war news together. The absurdity of a German prisoner and an American farmer sitting side by side, learning how the war progressed. The war that was, increasingly, going very badly for Germany. When news of the Battle of the Bulge reached them in December, Fred glanced at Kurt. "That your outfit?" "No. I was Italy." "Good." Kurt understood the implication. If he had been in the Ardennes, he might have killed Fred's sons, or Fred's sons might have killed him. The alternate timelines hung unspoken between them, ghost versions of a different history. In February, Ella Herbst did something remarkable. She knocked on the door of Kurt's room carrying an armful of clothes, shirts, trousers, a winter coat. "These were Danny's," she said, referring to their eldest son, currently somewhere in France with the 82nd Airborne. "He won't mind you using them while he's gone." Kurt stared at the clothes, understanding the extraordinary gesture. She was lending him her son's clothes, her son who was fighting his former army. "I cannot. You'll freeze in those prison clothes. Don't be proud. Take them." He took them. The coat fit perfectly. March 1945. The joke started casually, the way most important things do. They were repairing a fence line, Kurt holding posts, while Fred pounded them deep into thawing earth. The radio had announced another German defeat, another 100 miles of retreat, the inexorable collapse of the Reich. "You know," Fred said, not looking up from his work, "my boys are over there, and my German son is here. World's a funny place." Kurt had frozen mid-motion. "You're... what?" Fred grinned. "My German son. That's you. You work like one of my boys. You eat at my table. You wear Danny's coat. Close enough." It was said lightly, almost throwaway, but Kurt felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement of identity and belonging. He had spent 19 years as a Sudeten German, 11 months as a Wehrmacht soldier, 8 months as a prisoner of war. Now he was Fred Herbst's German son, and somehow that identity fit better than any of the others had. The name stuck. When neighbors visited, Fred would introduce him. "This is Kurt, my German son." Some found it charming. Others found it treasonous. Fred didn't care. He had discovered something about himself that winter. He had enough room in his heart for 5 sons, even if one of them had been born on the wrong side of the war. For Kurt, the designation was revolutionary. He had expected to be tolerated, perhaps, or grudgingly accepted as necessary labor. He had not expected to be claimed, to belong. To have a man who could have been his enemy choose to be his father instead. He wrote about it in his letters, even though he knew they wouldn't arrive. The act of writing had become its own kind of communication, a message cast into the void in the hope that somehow, someday, someone who mattered would know. I was lost, and I was found. Spring arrived, and with it another dimension of Kurt's education. Fred Herbst wasn't just a dairy farmer, he was one of the finest butchers in Washtenaw County, a skill passed down from his father, who had learned it in Bavaria before immigrating to Michigan in 1881. The butcher shop occupied a converted shed behind the main barn, its walls lined with knives and saws and hooks, the air permanently flavored with salt and smoke. It was here, in this temple of practical anatomy, that Kurt found his true calling. He had helped with butchering in the Sudetenland, but always as an assistant, never as the craftsman. Fred taught him everything: how to read a carcass, how to follow the seams between muscle groups, how to transform an animal into precisely portioned cuts that maximized value and minimized waste. Butchering is respect, Fred explained, guiding Kurt's knife along a beef shoulder. You're taking a life that gave everything for you. You honor it by wasting nothing. Kurt learned to make sausage, that ancient transformation of scraps into delicacy. He learned the ratios of meat to fat, the blend of spices that distinguished German bratwurst from Polish kielbasa, from Italian sausage. He learned the patience required for proper smoking, the precise temperature and time that converted raw pork into ham worthy of a holiday table. His hands, always capable, became artist's hands. He could break down a pig in 40 minutes, a process that required the intimate knowledge of anatomy, the confidence of precise knife work, the efficiency of someone who understood that time was money and waste was sin. Local farmers began requesting Kurt specifically. Send the German kid, they'd say. He knows what he's doing. It was, Kurt understood, the highest compliment. In agricultural communities, competence was currency. Theory was worthless. Results were everything, and he produced results. By summer, Fred had submitted paperwork to the camp requesting Kurt's permanent assignment to the Herbst farm. The request was approved. Kurt would spend the rest of his captivity in Saline, Michigan, becoming something he had never expected to be, a master butcher. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ended not with drama, but with a radio announcement at noon. Fred and Kurt were in the barn treating a cow with an abscess when Ella appeared in the doorway, her face unreadable. "It's over," she said. Germany surrendered. Kurt set down his tools carefully. Fred stood, wiping his hands on his work pants. The three of them stood in a triangle of silence, each processing what this meant in their own way. For Fred and Ella, it meant their boys might come home. Danny and William were alive. They'd received letters confirming it just last week. The danger wasn't gone, not entirely, but the war that had held their sons was finished. For Kurt, it meant something more complex, relief that the dying would stop, horror at what would be revealed in the coming months, the camps, the genocide, the full machinery of evil that had operated in his nation's name, and uncertainty about his own future now that he was officially the citizen of a defeated nation. Saline celebrated that night. Church bells rang. People gathered in the streets. Fred and Ella went to town for the festivities. Kurt stayed at the farm, sitting on the porch of his room, listening to the distant sounds of celebration. He was happy the war was over. He was devastated by what his country had done. He was grateful to be alive. He was terrified of what came next. All of it was true simultaneously, a cocktail of emotions too complex to explain, even if he'd had the words. Fred found him there when they returned late that night. "You okay?" Kurt shrugged. "I don't know what I am." Fred sat down on the porch step, the old wood creaking under his weight. For a long moment, neither spoke. "My granddad came from Bavaria," Fred said finally. 1881. Left because there was no future for him there. He was German until the day he died, spoke it at home, made German food, sang German songs. But he was also American. You can be both. You don't have to choose. Kurt looked at the older man, this American father who had somehow adopted him across every conceivable boundary. "I think," Kurt said slowly, "I think maybe I am not German anymore, not the way I was. Then what are you?" "I don't know. Not yet." Fred nodded. "Fair enough. You got time to figure it out." But Kurt didn't have time. What he had was 15 months before forced repatriation would send him back to a Germany that no longer existed. Summer and fall, 1945. The world learned the truth in stages, each revelation more horrific than the last. Photographs appeared in newspapers. Testimonies emerged from survivors, numbers that seemed impossible, that the human mind rejected as hyperbole, proved to be conservative estimates. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more. Romani, disabled political prisoners, homosexuals, Slavs, systematically exterminated. Death camps with names that would scar history. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. The industrial efficiency of genocide. Kurt read the newspapers in the Herbst kitchen, his hands shaking, nausea rising in his throat. This was what the Wehrmacht had protected. This was what his uniform had represented, whether he knew it or not. "I didn't know," he said to Fred, though he hadn't been asked. I swear we didn't know." Fred set down his coffee cup carefully. "I believe you. But your not knowing doesn't undo it." "No. You gonna carry that guilt?" Kurt looked up, surprised. Shouldn't I? You didn't do it. You were 19, conscripted, sent to Italy. You fired your weapon twice and hit nothing. You're guilty of being born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's all. Fred leaned forward. The question is, what are you going to do now? Spend your life apologizing for other people's evil? Or build something better? Kurt had no answer. Not then. But he thought about it through the harvest season, as he helped bring in corn and hay, as he worked in the butcher shop, as he ate dinner with a family that had decided he was worth saving. He thought about the difference between collective guilt and personal responsibility. He thought about the fact that he had been given, against all probability, a second chance. In October, Fred's sons came home, Danny and William Herbst, thinner than their photographs, older than their years, carrying the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much. They arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and Kurt, understanding that his presence might be unwelcome, made himself scarce. But Danny sought him out in the barn that evening. "You're the German son," Danny said. It wasn't a question. "Your father, he makes jokes." "No." Danny cut him off. "I heard about you. Dad wrote us. You've been keeping this place running while we were gone." Kurt didn't know what to say. Danny extended his hand. "Thank you." They shook. Two young men born 6,000 miles and a war apart, connected by a farm in Michigan, and a father who had enough heart for all of them. That night, the Herbst family gathered around the dinner table, all of them together for the first time in 3 years. Fred at the head, Ella at his side, Danny and William home from war, Agnes with her new fiancé, and Kurt, the German son, fitting into the space they had made for him. "We have much to be grateful for," Fred said, bowing his head. And they were. January 1946. The order came through official channels. All German POWs were to be repatriated. The war had been over for 8 months. It was time to return them to Germany to face whatever future awaited. Kurt received his notice on January 15th. He was to report to Camp Custer by February 1st for processing and transport. From there, he would be shipped to a holding facility in France, then released into Germany to what? The country was rubble. The economy didn't exist. Millions were homeless, starving, desperately foraging through ruins for anything that might sustain life. He had received exactly 2 letters from his family in the past year. They were alive, living in a refugee camp near Munich. His mother's handwriting shook. "There is no food. We survive on handouts from aid organizations. Do not come back. There is nothing here for you." But the American government didn't care about individual circumstances. The Geneva Convention required repatriation. Kurt would return whether he wanted to or not. Fred took the news badly. "That's bullshit," he said, with more vehemence than Kurt had ever heard from him. "You've worked this farm for 15 months. You've earned a place here. The law, I know the goddamn law. I'm saying it's wrong." Kurt appreciated the sentiment, but he also understood reality. He was a defeated enemy. He had no rights. His future would be determined by bureaucrats who had never met him and didn't care. He spent his last weeks on the farm in a state of numb preparation. He committed everything to memory: the layout of the fields, the personalities of the cows, the smell of Ella's cooking, the sound of Fred's laugh, the feeling of belonging that he had never expected to find. On January 31st, Ella pressed an envelope into his hands. "Open it when you're on the ship," she said. Inside was $200, more money than Kurt had ever possessed, and a letter. "You will always have family here. Come back to us when you can." Ella Kurt folded the letter carefully, placed it in his shirt pocket over his heart, and climbed into the truck that would take him to Camp Custer, to France, to Germany, to uncertainty. April 1946, Bavaria, Germany. The Germany Kurt returned to was unrecognizable. Not because the landscape had changed, though it had, brutally, but because the collective psychology had shattered. The certainty, the sense of destiny, the confidence that had animated the Reich, all of it evaporated like morning fog. Munich was rubble. Berlin was rubble. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, rubble. 70 million cubic meters of destroyed buildings, a mathematical expression of civilizational collapse. Kurt found his family in a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of Munich. His mother had aged 15 years in 3. His sisters were stick-thin, wearing American surplus clothes 3 sizes too large. They lived in a converted barracks with 40 other families, privacy achieved by hanging blankets between cots. "You came back," his mother said, embracing him with fierce intensity. "I came back," he confirmed, though he understood immediately that this was a mistake. There was no work. What jobs existed went to those with connections, party affiliations, black market access. Kurt had none of these. What he had was a skill, butchering, but there was nothing to butcher. Livestock had been requisitioned, slaughtered, consumed. The food came from aid organizations, rationed with bureaucratic precision, 1,550 calories per day, if you were lucky, less if you weren't. He tried. For 6 months, he genuinely tried to build a life in the ruins. He found work occasionally, hauling rubble, clearing mines, doing day labor that paid in cigarettes more than currency. He stood in bread lines. He watched his sister's ribs become more visible. He felt the particular despair of powerlessness. And every night he thought about Michigan, the abundance, the dignity, the work that mattered. The family that had chosen him. In October, he made a decision. He went to the American Occupation Authorities and inquired about immigration. The clerk, a board sergeant from Ohio, laughed. "Immigration, kid, we got 10 million Germans who want to go to America. You got family there, money, skills." "I have family," Kurt said, "and I have skills." The sergeant sighed. "Fill out these forms. Don't hold your breath." Kurt filled out the forms, and then he did something he should have done months earlier. He wrote to Fred Herbst. The letter took 6 weeks to reach Saline. It arrived in Fred's mailbox on a Tuesday morning in December, the envelope marked with German postal stamps and the fingerprints of multiple censors' offices. Fred opened it at the kitchen table. Ella watched his face as he read, saw the progression of emotions, concern, anger, determination. "Dear Fred and Ella, I hope this letter finds you well and that the farm prospers. I think of you every day. I am with my family in Munich, but I must tell you truthfully, there is no future here. There is no work. There is barely food. My mother and sisters survive on aid rations. Germany has destroyed not just buildings, but spirit. I do not know if it is possible, but I must ask, is there a way for me to return to America? I will work any job. I will pay any price. I learned in Michigan what it means to have dignity, to have purpose, to have family. I cannot unlearn these things. I understand if this is not possible. You have done more for me than I deserved. But if there is a way, please help me find it." With deepest respect and gratitude, Kurt Fred set down the letter. Ella met his eyes across the table. "We're bringing him back," Fred said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ella agreed. "We are." What followed was a masterclass in determined bureaucracy. Fred Herbst, a man who had spent his life dealing with the complexities of agriculture and livestock, applied the same systematic problem-solving to the challenge of immigration law. He needed to prove that Kurt had a job waiting, so he wrote a formal letter of employment, offering Kurt full-time work as a butcher and farm manager at a salary of $150 per month. He needed to prove that Kurt wouldn't be a public charge, so he submitted bank statements showing his ability to support an additional worker. He needed character references, so he collected letters from his pastor, the mayor of Saline, the president of the local Rotary Club, all attesting to Kurt's good character and work ethic. He needed to navigate the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed immigration of certain refugees from Europe, so he hired a lawyer in Ann Arbor who specialized in immigration law. The process took 2 years. 2 years of paperwork, appeals, interviews, bureaucratic delays. 2 years during which Kurt survived in Germany, sustained only by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was fighting for him. Finally, in November 1948, Kurt received a letter from the American consulate in Munich. "Your visa application has been approved." February 14, 1949, Kurt Gabel returned to America on Valentine's Day, a coincidence he would later consider cosmically appropriate. He sailed from Bremen on the SS Marine Falcon, carrying everything he owned in a single battered suitcase, 2 changes of clothes, his butcher's knives carefully wrapped in oilcloth, and the letters from the Herbst family that had sustained him through 2 years in the ruins. The Atlantic crossing took 9 days. Kurt spent most of them on deck, regardless of weather, watching the ocean scroll past and thinking about the circularity of his life. He had crossed this water once as a prisoner, expecting nothing. He was crossing it now as an immigrant, carrying the weight of hope, which was somehow heavier than despair. The New York skyline emerged from morning fog like a promise made solid. Ellis Island, immigration processing, the stamp in his passport that transformed him from displaced person to permanent resident. And then, finally, the train to Michigan, watching America unreal outside the window, the enormity of it, the prosperity, the casual abundance that still seemed impossible after years of scarcity. Fred Herbst met him at the Ann Arbor train station. They saw each other through the crowd, and Kurt felt something break open in his chest. Fred was older, grayer, but the same. Solid, real, home. They embraced without words. Two men who had found each other across a war and decided that family was a choice, not an accident of blood. "Welcome back, son," Fred said. And Kurt was home. The room above the garage was waiting for him, exactly as he'd left it. Ella had made the bed with fresh linens. There were wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, even though it was February, and she must have driven to the florist in Saline to get them. Kurt stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple fact of being remembered, of mattering enough that someone had prepared for his arrival. The work resumed as if he'd never left. The morning milking, the endless cycle of agricultural tasks that marked the seasons. The butcher shop, where his hands remembered skills even before his mind consciously recalled them. But Kurt was different now. He had seen what loss looked like, what genuine deprivation meant. The work wasn't just work anymore. It was a kind of prayer, an active gratitude expressed through labor. Fred noticed the change. "You're even better than before," he observed one day, watching Kurt break down a beef carcass with surgical precision. "I understand now what this means," Kurt replied. "To have work. To have purpose, to have enough." Within 6 months, Kurt had saved enough money to move his mother and sisters to America. The process was simpler now. He was a legal resident, employed, able to sponsor family members. They arrived in August, and Kurt met them at the same Ann Arbor station where Fred had welcomed him. His mother cried when she saw him. Not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of survival, of all of them making it through the fire to something like peace. Fred helped Kurt find them a small house in Saline. Kurt's sisters found work at the local hosiery factory. His mother, who had spent 3 years in a refugee camp, planted a garden that first summer that was a marvel of German efficiency. Every inch utilized, every plant precisely spaced, the vegetables growing with determined abundance. They were building new lives from the wreckage of old ones, and it was working. 1952, Kurt Gable married Dorothy Schneider in the spring, a German-American girl from Ann Arbor whose family had immigrated in the 1920s. They bought a small house on Monroe Street in Saline, 3 blocks from the town center. Kurt was 27 years old, an age when most men are still figuring out their direction. He had already died and been reborn once. The wedding was small, family, close friends, the Herbsts in the front row. Fred gave a toast that made everyone laugh and several people cry. "I gained a German son in wartime. Now I'm gaining a German daughter-in-law in peace. This is what winning looks like." By 1954, Kurt had saved enough to open his own business. He found a small storefront on East Michigan Avenue, a former hardware store with good bones and reasonable rent. He spent 3 months renovating it himself, installing refrigeration units, building cutting tables, creating a display case for finished products. The sign went up in April. Kurt's German-style Sausage Saline, Michigan, was not a place that typically embraced foreign food. The local culinary tradition ran toward pot roast and Jell-O salad, but Kurt had 2 advantages: genuine skill and Fred Herbst's reputation. Fred told everyone who would listen, "That boy makes the best bratwurst this side of Bavaria. You haven't lived until you've tried his smoked ham." People came out of curiosity. They returned because the products were exceptional. Kurt made authentic German sausages: bratwurst, knackwurst, weisswurst, leberwurst. He made smoked meats that required patience and precision. He sourced the best cuts from local farmers, many of whom had employed him as a POW years earlier. He refused to compromise on quality, even when it would have been more profitable to do so. "My name is on the sign," he explained to Dorothy when she suggested he could charge less by using cheaper ingredients. "My name is all I have." The shop prospered, not dramatically. This wasn't a tale of overnight success, but steadily. sustainably. Word spread through Washtenaw County. People drove from Ann Arbor, from Ypsilanti, from as far as Detroit to buy Kurt sausages. He hired employees. He expanded the product line. He became a fixture of Saline's business community, joining the Chamber of Commerce, sponsoring Little League teams, donating to school fundraisers. He was, in the most complete sense, American. July 4th, 1955. Kurt Gabel became a United States citizen in a ceremony at the Federal Building in Detroit. He stood with 43 other immigrants from Poland, Italy, Hungary, Mexico, China, and raised his right hand to swear allegiance to a country that had first held him prisoner, then set him free. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. The words had weight. He was renouncing Germany, the country of his birth, the language of his childhood, the geography that had shaped his early years. But Germany had renounced him first, had conscripted him for a war he didn't believe in, had built ovens to murder millions, had left him with nothing but ash and shame. That I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This he could promise easily. America had given him dignity when he expected cruelty, opportunity when he expected imprisonment, family when he expected loneliness. That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Fred and Ella Herbst sat in the gallery, watching, Dorothy beside them, 7 months pregnant with their first child, his mother, his sisters, the family he had rebuilt from ruins. When the judge proclaimed them citizens, Kurt felt something release in his chest. He was no longer a displaced person, no longer a former enemy, no longer a refugee. He was simply American, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. They celebrated that night at the Herbst farm, a backyard barbecue with neighbors and friends. Fred, slightly drunk on beer and sentiment, put his arm around Kurt's shoulders. "Remember when I first called you my German son?" "Yes." "Well, now you're just my son, American son." Kurt smiled. "I was always both, German and American. You taught me that." "No," Fred said. "You taught me that. I just gave you the space to figure it out." 1968. Fred Herbst died in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 weeks after his 77th birthday. He had spent the previous day doing what he always did, working the farm, tending the animals, living the life he had built with his hands and his heart. Kurt got the call at 6 a.m. He closed the butcher shop for the day, drove to the farm, and sat with Ella in the kitchen where he had eaten his first meal as a prisoner of war 24 years earlier. "He loved you," Ella said. "You know that." "I know. I loved him too. He wanted you to have the tools." From the butcher shop, she gestured toward the converted shed where Fred had taught Kurt the craft that became his livelihood. He said you'd know what to do with them. Kurt did know. Those tools, knives with worn handles, saws that had processed 1,000 carcasses, hooks that had held countless sides of beef, represented more than equipment. They were the physical embodiment of knowledge passed from father to son, the tactile proof that skill and care and excellence mattered. The funeral was large. Saline turned out to honor one of its own. Fred's son spoke, and his daughter, and his grandchildren. And then Kurt spoke, the German prisoner of war, who had become an American son. "Fred Herbst taught me what it means to be human," Kurt said. "Not through words, but through actions. He taught me that family is not about blood, but about choice. He taught me that dignity is not given, it's recognized. He taught me that the best response to hatred is radical kindness." He paused, looking at the casket holding the man who had saved his life without ever mentioning it. "I came to this country as an enemy. Fred made me family. I came expecting cruelty. He gave me grace. I came with nothing. He gave me everything that matters. I cannot repay what he gave me, but I can honor it. I can pass it forward. I can teach my children what he taught me, that the world is better when we choose compassion over convenience, when we see humanity in the stranger, when we understand that we are all, every one of us, worthy of dignity. Fred Herbst was my father in every way that counts, and I will miss him every day for the rest of my life." Ella squeezed his hand. The church was silent except for the sound of people trying not to cry. 1985. Kurt Gable stood in his butcher shop on a Saturday morning, training his grandson Michael in the art of sausage making. The boy was 16, the same age Kurt had been when he was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. But Michael's life would be nothing like Kurt's had been at that age. Michael had grown up in peace, in prosperity, in a country that valued him. The ratio is critical, Kurt explained, guiding Michael's hands. Too much fat and it's greasy. Too little and it's dry. You have to feel it. Michael nodded, concentrating. He had his grandfather's hands, capable, precise, patient. Kurt watched him work and felt the vertigo of time. 41 years since he had first crossed the Atlantic as a prisoner. 40 years since Fred Herbst had broken the rules and invited him to dinner. 36 years since he had returned to build a life from nothing. The shop had prospered beyond his early hopes. He employed 8 people now. His products were distributed to specialty stores across Michigan. He had been featured in the Detroit Free Press, in Gourmet magazine, in a PBS documentary about immigrant success stories. But the real measure of success wasn't fame or profit. It was this: his grandson learning a craft, building a skill, preparing to carry something forward into the future. "Did you really come here as a prisoner?" Michael asked, not for the first time. "Yes." "And great-grandpa Fred just treated you like family?" "Yes." "Why?" Kurt considered the question. He had spent 4 decades considering it. "Because he understood something important," Kurt said finally. "He understood that who we are matters more than where we come from. He saw past the uniform, past the war, past the propaganda, and recognized something human. And then he acted on it." "That's pretty radical." Kurt smiled. "It was. It still is. Kindness is always radical." Michael returned to the sausage making, the conversation apparently complete. But Kurt knew it would resurface, that his grandson would think about it, that the story would continue to ripple forward through time. That evening, Kurt drove out to the cemetery. Fred and Ella were buried side by side, their headstone simple: Herbst. "Beloved." Kurt placed flowers on the grave, a ritual he performed monthly. "Michael's learning the trade," he said to the stone, to the memory, to whatever part of Fred still existed in the universe. "He's good, patient. He reminds me of you." The cemetery was quiet. Spring birds called from the trees. The sun angled toward evening, casting long shadows across the grass. "I never thanked you properly," Kurt continued, "not for the farm work or the butchering lessons, for seeing me, for choosing me, for teaching me that family is something we build, not something we're born into." He stood there for a long time, remembering the first meal at the Herbst kitchen table, the winter mornings in the dairy barn, the moment Fred had first called him son, the letters from Germany, the reunion at the train station, the 40 years of friendship and work and life that had followed. "I built a good life," Kurt said finally, "because you gave me the foundation. I hope I've honored that. I hope I've passed it forward." The wind moved through the trees. Kurt touched the headstone once gently and walked back to his car. 2010. Kurt Gable died peacefully at age 85, surrounded by his children and grandchildren in the same Saline hospital where all 4 of his kids had been born. His obituary in the Saline Reporter ran 2 full columns, detailing a life that read like fiction, but was entirely true. Kurt Gable, Holocaust witness, German POW, American immigrant, master butcher, community leader, father of 4, grandfather of 9, great-grandfather of 12, died on Thursday. He was preceded in death by his wife Dorothy and his adoptive American father, Fred Herbst. He is survived by more people than can be counted: students he trained, customers he served, lives he touched with his quiet insistence that dignity and excellence and kindness were not optional but essential. Kurt's German-style sausage continued under the management of his son Robert. The shop had been a Saline institution for 56 years. The recipes Kurt had perfected, the bratwurst, the smoked ham, the liver sausage that won awards at the Michigan State Fair, remained unchanged. On the wall of the shop, Robert hung a photograph. 2 men standing in front of a barn, circa 1945. One is an older American farmer, weathered and solid. The other is a young German prisoner of war, thin and uncertain. They're standing close together, the farmer's hand on the young man's shoulder, both of them squinting into the camera with expressions that suggest they're not entirely sure how they ended up as family, but they're grateful for it nonetheless. Below the photograph, a small plaque reads, Fred Herbst and Kurt Gable. Family is what we build together. The story of Kurt Gable and Fred Herbst is not unique. Across America during World War II, thousands of similar stories unfolded. Enemy prisoners of war finding unexpected humanity, farmers choosing compassion over convenience, barriers dissolving under the pressure of shared work and shared meals. But each individual story is unique because each represents a specific choice made by specific people in specific moments. Fred Herbst could have followed the rules. He could have kept Kurt at arm's length, used him for labor without offering dignity, enforced the boundary between captor and captive. He chose differently. That choice, replicated in small ways across thousands of farms and millions of interactions, represents something fundamental about human nature. We are not predetermined by our categories. We are not bound by the boxes that governments and ideologies and accidents of birth place us in. We are capable, always, of recognition, of seeing the human in the other, of choosing connection over division. Kurt Gable arrived in Michigan as an enemy combatant, a representative of a regime that had perpetrated unthinkable evil. He could have been treated as such, imprisoned, isolated, returned to Germany, without ever understanding that alternatives existed. Instead, he was given a different gift, the opportunity to be seen as himself, separate from uniform and nationality and war, to be recognized as a young man who knew cows and crops, who had skills and dignity, who was capable of growth and change and belonging. Fred Herbst didn't save Kurt Gable from death. The American military did that by capturing him. What Fred saved him from was smaller and larger. The death of hope, the death of possibility, the death of faith in human goodness. And in return, Kurt didn't just provide labor. He provided Fred with the opportunity to be the person Fred wanted to be, the kind of man who saw past uniforms to humanity, who understood that cruelty is easy and compassion is courageous, who believed that family was something you built, not something you were born into. They saved each other in the way that genuine relationships always involve mutual salvation. This story matters not because it's exceptional, though it is, but because it's replicable. The choice Fred Herbst made is available to all of us every day, in smaller ways. We can choose to see the human in the person society has labeled as other. We can choose to extend dignity to those who have no claim on our generosity. We can choose to build family across the boundaries that history and politics and accident have erected. These choices are not easy. They require us to override instinct and programming and the comfortable tribalism that makes the world simple. They require us to risk ridicule from those who believe that boundaries are sacred and categories are destiny. But they are possible. Always possible. Kurt Gable's life, from Wehrmacht conscript to American butcher, from enemy prisoner to beloved father and grandfather, proves it. The small room above Fred Herbst's garage, where a 19-year-old German prisoner first slept fitfully in the autumn of 1944, still exists. The farm has been sold, subdivided, turned into housing. But the room remains, incorporated into someone else's house. Its history unknown to the current occupants. But history doesn't require recognition to remain true. A choice was made there. A boundary was crossed. A human connection was forged that would ripple forward through decades and generations, affecting hundreds of lives in ways large and small. Fred Herbst called Kurt Gable his German son, and in doing so, redrew the map of what family could mean. Kurt Gable accepted that designation, built a life from it, and passed it forward to his children and grandchildren, who carry within them the knowledge that identity is not fixed, that redemption is possible, that the world is always more spacious and forgiving than we expect, if we have the courage to test its boundaries. This is the story of two men who could have been enemies and chose to be family instead. And in that choice, they built something that outlasted them both. Proof that the best part of being human is our capacity to surprise ourselves with kindness.